Hey everybody, today we are going to talk about vertex painting, which is another option we have to use to paint colors onto the surfaces of our models. Previously we've talked about texture mapping, which tends to be a little better suited for models with fewer polys. Vertex painting works by associating a color with each of the vertices that makes up this model, so you want to have a higher density model, otherwise you're not going to have enough vertices to make up a nice looking high resolution texture. And some of this information is going to be specific to my class because we're working with a specific printer that has certain capabilities. For example, we're limited to a 2K texture file and so forth. So even as I say that a high resolution model or a high poly model such as the one we've got here is better off with vertex painting, because we're going out to a 3D printer. In our particular case, we need to switch back over to a texture map at some point anyway, but that doesn't mean that we can't start with vertex painting. So let's show you how to set up vertex painting. The first thing that I'm going to do is to switch one of my views here to the shader editor. And by default, I should have these two little nodes associated with the default geometry of sculpture. I'm going to come over here and Shift A and do a search for the term vertex, and we'll add a vertex color. If I can get my mouse to catch up. There's not many options here, right? So we're just going to connect color to base color, and that's going to get us started. Back over here, I'm going to go to my materials preview, and you can see that initially I get the notification that something has changed, but that black tells me that I'm not necessarily done. I also want to go over here and check on my properties, and I can see that vertex color is indeed hooked up. Okay, cool. So we should be ready to go. I'll switch over from sculpture mode down to vertex paint, and then that pops us back into white. Okay, so generally when you're painting something, you're going to want a base color that's not just white, unless you're making a ghost or something like that. So let's just start off with a different base color, say that's in the green territory. And I'll go up to paint in the menu, and I'll say set vertex colors, right? So that saves me the fact of having to come through here and just scribble that all down. And then maybe I'll come up here with blue for the features. I can select, let's see where our axes are. So maybe I'll do some symmetry on either side of the y-axis, do X symmetry, and then I can start to get in here and, like paint in little eyes and paint in a little mouth and so forth. Now, one of the things that my students have noticed as they're working here is that sometimes you'll wind up with a little apparent, it looks like a little bit of pixelization. And the reason for that, if we zoom in real close, if you think about it, and I go into, well, wireframe's not going to work here because I just have a geometric prime. But basically, that's the refinement of each of my polys, right? So if we can only associate colors, or if we can only change colors every so often like that, the computer's going to have to kind of fake it a little bit to make up that edge. Also, by default, we're working with a brush that has a certain kind of fall off, right? So it kind of comes down like that. If we want to get some harder edges, we can pick a different fall off profile, and then we'll get something like that, although it's still giving me a little bit of that fuzzy edge. So one way to fix this would be just to rebuild this model with more polys, and I can do that by going to sculpt mode, say select R, I can get like a higher degree of refinement, and then if I control R, now I've rebuilt the surface so the faces are smaller, but the only downside is that's going to wipe out all of the work I've done thus far with vertex painting. So my recommendation is that you get into vertex mode, you get your model down to the place where you think it needs to be, and then you move your brush size to the smallest detail that you plan to add. And you can see that right here at that brush size, those details are still looking a little bit gnarly. So we're going to head back to sculpt mode, Shift R, and make this thing even smaller. Maybe down to there. Control R to rebuild. That's going to, oh, interesting. It looks like it didn't wipe out my vertex colors. Is that the case? I must have done something wrong there if it didn't wipe out my colors. So let's try that one more time. Okay, so we're in sculpt mode. Are we, in fact, in sculpt mode? Yes, we are. So I'll undo that. Shift R. Those nice tiny polys, Control R. So that's what I was looking for. So maybe the command just didn't take before. Back to vertex paint, back to a small brush size, and then just verify what we're doing is going to be passable. And when you're close up, some of those little crunchy bits are going to be really apparent, but if you think about how big you're actually going to be printing this thing and how far away you'll be seeing it from, a lot of that stuff looks a lot nicer once you get a little further away. So we're just going to be making 5-inch figures, so we don't have to worry too much about what things look like when we're super zoomed in. Okay, so in order to do this demo, let's just make this thing, let's say, we'll set the whole vertex color. If you have a bunch of nooks and crannies, like say that you made a really complex sculpt of a skull or something like that, you can also mess around with doing dirty vertex colors. That's not really going to show me anything right now because I don't have nooks and crannies to demonstrate, but it will sort of automatically darken some of the creases and lighten some of the high spots on your model to help you fake a more complex geometry, but we're not worried about that right now. Okay, got my symmetry on. Let's just grab a color that's really easy to see. I'll come in here and sort of make some little eyes. Oh, you can see that's looking a lot nicer now from a distance, right? Make our little pouty face right here. Maybe I'll come back in with like an eye color or something and put some pupils in. Okay, so when you do this, it's going to be much better than mine, but that'll just give us a place to start. And again, you can always take this later on in these steps and export it out to Illustrator or Photoshop or something like that, but you can't do it until we've converted this to a texture map, and right now it's vertex painting. So how do we convert this to a texture map? Let's take a look. So the first thing I'll do is to open up another viewer, and I'll come back down here to the shader editor. And this is just a little trick for adding in an image. It's kind of a shortcut. I'll Shift A and do a search for image. And I'll pick image texture. And I'll hit new. So we're just going to call this, I've got so many of these named the same thing. I'm going to call it after today's date so that I don't start getting confused. I know that the printer that I'm going out to maxes out at a 2K texture, so I'm just going to multiply each of these lines by 2 to get 2048. And then in terms of the color, you may find it's useful to get this a little bit closer to the background color of what you're working with, even if it's not exact, right? Because that way, if you do mess this up a little bit, it'll be harder to see. So we'll do something like that. And it looks like I clicked in the wrong place and I got to do this again. Curses. I'm going to leave these mistakes in so you can learn from my hurrying along here. You know what? I'm going to leave the color as black so that you can really see what I'm up to, although I'll show you how it might cause problems down the line. There's also some problems I'm running into that people online are saying can be solved by unchecking alpha, right? So alpha is going to be a transparency channel. Sometimes when you do this, you'll see little cracks on the surface that describe where the different sections of the UVs have been broken off into chunks. And I've been reading that people say unchecking alpha helps with that, so we'll go ahead and do that. Okay, so now I've got an image. It's just sitting over here not doing anything yet. So we're going to leave that alone temporarily. Okay, but now the image has been created. So if we go over to the UV editor, and then I come back here to object mode, I can tab over into edit, and then grab all of these UVs, or rather these vertices, hit U, and in this case, instead of trying to unwrap it by hand, which would be very easy with a sphere, but probably would be a lot more difficult based on what you're creating, we're going to do Smart UV Project. Okay, so a couple things to look out for here. One is the angle limit. So the higher this number is, the bigger chunks that the computer is going to try to make. So it's going to try to keep things in these sort of massive islands. As that gets a little bit smaller, it'll break things off into smaller islands. So if you do this process and you find that you're getting a bunch of weird colors in the wrong spots on your surface and so forth, you can make this number smaller and you'll just get lots and lots more teeny islands. So let's just, maybe I'll just pull this down to 50 or something like that. The island margin describes how far apart those islands are going to be, and I can hover my mouse here and it'll give me a little tooltip that should describe this, or at least I thought it did. There we go. So the margin to reduce bleed from adjacent islands. So the bigger this is, the farther apart they're going to be. So let's go with 005. If this is too large, you're just not going to be making very efficient use of your relatively limited 2K area. And I'll leave correct aspect checked and area weight as 0. So we'll hit OK. All right, so if I zoom out here, you can see that based on my 50 degrees, right, that's what determines why I got all of these little teeny tiny pieces broken out as individual spots. And my model is so simple that that's probably not necessary. So we can do this again just to give you an example. Smart UV Project. In this case, let's go up to 66, which was the original default. and then maybe I'll pull this up to 0.01 so you can watch the difference. Okay, so with 0.01, now we've got a little bit more space in between all of these individual pieces, and there should be fewer pieces now because we moved that number up, although it's a little bit hard to tell. In any case, this is going to be different depending on your model. Everyone's going to have to do this a little bit differently, so as long as you know what these different features accomplish, you can play around with them. Okay, now we're going to do the process of moving our vertex painting over to the texture map, and that's going to be known as baking. So in order to get our baking done, let me move back out to object mode just so I can see this work. Okay, so we are going to head back over here. I've lost my little buttons. I'm going to head up here to the top, which is our render settings, render properties. And then as I go down near to the bottom, I will find that bake is one of our options. Oh, and we need that to be the render engine cycles for this to work. So render engine cycles, we head down to bake. And then right at the top is your baking button, but we don't want to do that just yet. So the first thing we'll do is say bake type diffuse. Some of these I'm not really going to get into. We're also going to uncheck the contributions direct and indirect, which I believe means that we would sort of hard code the lighting color information into our model. So I'm going to uncheck those, but you can play with them if you want. The margin type is adjacent faces, and by default you have 16 pixels. And so this describes, as it says, it extends the baked result as a post-process filter. So it tries to fill up your UVs and then adds a couple more pixels on the outside of those UVs depending on the number that you pick. And I think 16 is quite a lot, so maybe I'll bump this down to 5 or something like that so we can save space. Okay, so once all of this is in place, I'm going to go hit bake, and this is pretty taxing on the computer, so I'm going to be pausing my computer while my fan just sits there and spins. Usually it takes a long time for the first 10% to get done, and the rest of it is relatively fast, but this is always also a pretty simple model. So let's hit bake and let's see what happens. Down here is your progress bar. Alright, so that wasn't too bad at all. On my 2017 MacBook, the process just took a couple of minutes, but you can expect something, potentially considerably longer with a more complex model. So you can see kind of why we haven't been working in texture mapping from the get-go when it comes to high poly stuff, because it's just so hard to control where all of those UVs are going to land and how they're going to be painted in. One thing I want to show you here, and first I'll go ahead and save that image. And we will call it that is fine. We can see that if we go, let's see, I want to bring those UVs up, which I think I do by going into object mode and clicking there. So if, or edit mode. So if I zoom in on these guys, I'll be able to see here that these are the, when I was selecting, what was the option? The size of the margin, there's where the margin shows up. And so what that prevents is these little black pixels from the background of creeping in and affecting the boundaries between all of these different islands when we go to render this with a texture map. So that's looking pretty good. I got my IVs set up and my texture map is all saved. Now the last thing we need to do to make sure that this works correctly, I'm going to come over here and zoom in and kind of take a close look at what that looks like. And then I'll come over here to my shader editor. And instead of vertex color forming our base color, we're going to allow our texture map to form our base color. And that does not look good at all. So let's see if we can adjust what is taking place here. I'm going to go over to Materials and verify that my surface is based on the correct thing here. Let's see. Wow, that looks super funky. I might need to pause this and go back and try to figure this out. Okay, so I was looking at this offline for a little bit here, and I think what I can do is demo for you the process that I'm going to need to go to, and you probably will too, of fixing something if you start to get some weird results. Okay, so right now I'm still viewing the texture map right here. So if I bring up the shader editor, I can switch back over to vertex color, and so now that's looking back to where I expect it to be. Let's try to unwrap these UVs again and do it a little bit differently. So this time I'm going to pick my object, Tab, A to select all, U and Smart UV Project. We're going to come all the way up to 66, which is the default, and let's go ahead and bring that island margin down to 0.001. So 66 and 0.001. I'll hit OK. So you can see how much more simple these are in this case, right? Okay, so let's take those, and I'm going to maybe scale them in ever so slightly. The other thing I want to check on is if those margins are indeed showing up, because right now they're only 0.001, and so we can see what that margin looks like right there. So that might not be enough, but then again it might be, so we'll go ahead and give this a shot. Okay, so now I'm going to head back over to Bake. Let's see here. Maybe what I can do, okay, so Bake, we're on cycles. Contributions are color. Maybe I'll just make that margin a 2, and we're going to let it clear the image, and then we're going to try to bake it again, and we'll see if this is any better. So here we go. Okay, once again, we've done our magic time travel. My image has been baked, and initially this looks entirely black, but that's just because right now I'm only looking at my UVs, my UV editor rather. So now I'm going to go over to Image Editor, and initially it's going to be hard to see because all these guys were selected, but now you can see this thing has gotten a lot more simple. And so now, let's see if this works correctly. I'll say save, and then I'll go to our shaders, and we'll switch these over. Cross your fingers, but it's looking pretty good. And ta-da, there you go. So there was something before about this model. The model is very simple. It really wanted as many of those faces to stay together as possible. So in our case, it was to our benefit to keep the angle higher. I did this with a 66. And the other thing we can check for too is to zoom way in and see if we can notice any teeny tiny visual artifacts that would be the margin down here not being big enough, and then we might see some of the background color, but that looks good too. So this is a general demo of how this goes. Everyone's mileage is going to be different. The more complicated your model gets, the more likely it is that not your margin, the angle, right? The angle from unwrapping UVs is going to have to be bigger. So give that a try, and when that's all done, the last thing you need to do, apart from saving your image, is go to, this is in terms of preparing for the 3D print. And so now we just bring up these options. We have our 3D print tab because that's the toolbox add-on that we used. And now you go down through here and you check to make sure that everything is manifold. So we'll do that real quick. Or maybe not so quick. And so I wind up with a bunch of overhang faces, again, just because this thing, shoots way out into space at steeper than a 45-degree angle, but that doesn't matter. The manifold is the big thing. We talked in class about how to fix manifold edges, so I won't talk about that here. It's possible you'll get lucky and be able just to click make manifold, and that'll take care of it. Finally, you can also scale this thing to bounds and then just tell the file to be exactly 5 inches tall, because that's the limitation we're working with. And then finally, with the particular rig that we're working with, we want to export as an OBJ where we apply scale, copy textures, and copy data layers. And that's the process of taking Vertex painting and converting it to a texture map with an eye towards 3D printing, at least on the particular machine that we're going to use.